Are you having a hard time figuring out what to get Dad for Father's Day? Shop now at sportshistorynetwork.com/row1 and save 15% off your order when you check out Row 1 Brand's Vintage Sports Pictorium Gallery. They have America's best sports art. With over 7,200 historic sports prints, you're assured to find something unique for Dad this Father's Day. If he's an NFL buff, check out the 1963 vintage NFL helmet poster. Shop now at sportshistorynetwork.com/row1.
Not every winner of a golf major championship is a widely known name. In fact, throughout the history of golf's major championships, there have been several unknowns who have risen to the top of the golf world to win the Masters, the U.S. Open, the Open Championship, or the PGA. And they've gone on to enjoy terrific careers on tour. Next, on Sports Forgotten Heroes, we're going to take a look back at three golfers who won a major championship and were virtually never heard from again. Mungo Park, David Brown, and Jack Fleck.
This is Sports Forgotten Heroes, a tribute to the stars who shaped the games we love to watch and the games we love to play. Stars who provided us with many thrills, but when their time was up, they faded away. We'll take a look back at their spectacular careers, their moments of fame, even if it was just for one season or just one game. And now, here's your host, Warren Rogan.
Hello and welcome to our latest edition of Sports Forgotten Heroes. And today, time for a little golf. Yep, we're going to put baseball to the side for a moment and talk some golf with a terrific guest, Connor T. Lewis. Connor, who has a wonderful podcast of his own, TalkinGolf History, and who founded the Society for Golf Historians, will join us in just a moment to talk about three men who won a golf major championship and were basically never heard from again: Mungo Park, David Brown, and Jack Fleck. Park, who came from a very strong golf lineage, won the 1874 Open Championship. Now, before you say anything about having to go way back in time to find such an unknown for many golf fans, it's not that much of a stretch, because that's when guys like old Tom Morris, young Tom Morris, and Willie Park, names very familiar, like I said, to many golfers, were the champions of the day. And the same goes for David Brown, who won the Open Championship in 1886. As for Jack Fleck, he was absolutely an unknown when he won the U.S. Open in 1955, his first win on tour. And then he went on to win just two more tournaments during his time on the PGA Tour. Now, all three have such unique stories, really cool stories about their victories, and they are told so well by Connor. Before we get there, though, remember, spread the word and let your family and friends know about Sports Forgotten Heroes. Sure, everyone knows about Babe Ruth and Michael Jordan and Jack Nicklaus and Wayne Gretzky, but how many know the story of Bill Barilko or Ed Delahanty or Frank Ryan? Our archives are filled with such great stories about sports and human interest. There's something here for everyone. Follow Sports Forgotten Heroes on Instagram. Follow on Twitter at SportsFHeroes. Find our page on Facebook and visit us at sportsfh.com, where you can email us with your suggestions and comments, learn more about our guests, learn more about the forgotten heroes we talk about, and so much more. That's sportsfh.com. Thanks. All right, now let's get to today's episode of Sports Forgotten Heroes, episode number 58, with a terrific golf historian, Connor T. Lewis. Connor, welcome to Sports Forgotten Heroes. Thanks for stopping by.
Happy to be on the show. Thank you for having me. Really appreciate it.
Awesome. Hey, why don't you tell us a little bit about the podcast that you're on, Talking Golf?
Yeah, you bet. The TalkinGolf History podcast. Rod Morey out of Australia, and I'm out of Tampa, Florida. we put together an idea of a podcast based on an interview I did, much like this one, with Rod Morey on, it was the I Seek Golf podcast. And we just talked golf history and kind of went from there. And he said, hey, you should really think about doing a podcast. And I said, well, no one would ever listen to it. And he convinced me. We're 11 episodes in, and I can't believe it, but we have thousands of listeners. So I'm a little shocked by that. But, I've been shocked from the get-go how fast the listenership and the Twitter followers and the Facebook group, specifically built around golf history, has taken off. It's really taken me aback, to be honest with you.
Very cool. And when do you release new episodes of Talking Golf?
Well, let's see. I release usually every 2 weeks. However, I am trying to put in a specialty podcast. So the majority of our podcasts just go under the brand Talking Golf History. And they are either discussions between Rod and myself, or we have guest hosts on our show like Sid Matthew. We'll have the senior director of the USGA Golf Museum on in the next week for the U.S. Open. And then once a month, we're planning on doing a specialty podcast called Golf from the Fringe. And it is unique to, I think, any golf podcast out there because it's a story. So, for instance, by the time I think this gets released, you'll be able to look at the Talking Golf History podcast. It will likely be episode 11, but it'll be a subcategory called Golf from the Fringe. And it's about a 40-minute narrative of the champion who lost his mind, which is the story of the youngest U.S. Open champion of all time, Johnny McDermott, who won 2 back-to-back U.S. Opens, and then within a year was committed to a insane asylum for the rest of his life.
Wow.
So I'm planning on a lot of stories like that once a month that, like golf history stories that nobody's ever heard of.
Sure. That's what makes these podcasts so interesting and why we do Sports Forgotten Heroes. It's a lot of fun.
Oh, absolutely. Same trend, same thought, right?
Very cool. And what about the Society of Golf Historians? How did that come about? And can you tell us a little bit about it?
Yeah, so funny enough, that started, I think, August of last year. So that'd be 2018, so we're not even a full year in. It started because a buddy of mine, I think, was just tired of me talking to him about golf history. And he was like, he was like, set up a Twitter account already. So I was like, all right, I'll try it. And literally, I thought I'd have 10 followers. And I think we're pushing 6,200 under a year.
Wow.
So, yeah. And it's been crazy. I mean, like, for instance, I think you're aware of this, but the Golf Channel picked up one of my stories, The Long Lost Legend of Lido, which is about the legendary Lido Club built by Charles Blair McDonald and Seth Rayner in 1914. And it no longer exists. It only existed from 14 to 1942. And I ended up doing a little special for the Golf Channel on Live from the PGA on the Lido. So it was myself and architect Jim Urbina walking the site and telling the story of the long-lost legend of Lido. So it was pretty cool.
Yeah, that sounds really cool. And Connor, where does your interest in golf stem from?
Wow, that's a good one. Honestly, I started golf late in life. We can blame that on my wife. We were dating at the time. This is, probably 17 years ago. So it's not even that long ago. And my wife just said, you need to pick up a hobby. You're boring the hell out of me. And I started playing golf. I remember, I'd say 2 or 3 rounds in, I played with my now in-laws, and they're all scratch, golfers. So they whooped me by like 40 strokes. And I just said, I'm either going to get really good at this game or I'm never going to play it. And so fortunately at the time I lived in Portland, Oregon, where you can swing a club year round, and kind of taught myself golf. And within, I'd say 3 years, I was a single digit. I've been as low as a 2. And then about 12 years ago, some crazy guy was at a golf show in Iowa. I moved to Iowa, and it was in the middle of winter, so you can't play golf in Iowa. And I went to a what do you call this? Like a golf dome where you can hit balls indoors. So I'm at this dome and hoping to hit some golf balls, and damn it if they didn't have like a golf show there. And it was like the worst golf show. It's like the kind you have in January where all of the polo shirts are like rainbow colored with matching shorts, like nothing you'd ever want to buy. And I ran into two guys, Bill Reed and Russ Fisher. And here's these guys, and they're wearing knickers and newsboy caps, and they have this whole stand of clubs with hickory shafts. And I'm like, look at these two guys. But I love history. I've always loved history. It wasn't specific to golf history at the time. And I struck up a conversation, and they kind of dared me into hitting a Walter Hagen hickory shafted driver. And I just busted that thing on the screws. I mean, it felt so good. And so I was kind of hooked. I started playing hickory golf for 7 years and gutty golf for 2 years after that. And I just started studying, 4 or 5 hours a day. And I'm weird. I'm one of those guys that if I read something with golf history, it sticks in my brain forever. But it's the only thing I have that ability for. It's a wasted superpower until Twitter, right? A wasted superpower.
Very interesting. Well, I'm glad we found you because you sound very passionate about golf history. And with all you're doing, I am sure we're going to have a great episode here of Sports Forgotten Heroes. So today we're going to do something a little different. As we get into the heart of the golf season and two of the most significant golf championships, they're on the horizon. The U.S. Open and just a few weeks later, the Open Championship, or British Open as many like to refer to it. We're going to discuss three unknown champions, or at least two unknown, and one whom many might have heard of but know little about. We're talking about Mungo Park, who won the Open Championship way back in 1874 at Musselburgh Links. David Brown, who won the 1886 Open Championship, also at Musselburgh, and finished second in the 1903 U.S. Open. And then we're going to jump ahead more than 50 years, really almost 70 years, to the 1955 U.S. Open Championship. And we're going to talk about one of its most unlikely winners, Jack Fleck, who beat Ben Hogan in an 18-hole playoff. So, if you can, please, first tell us what you can about Musselburgh. It played host to, like a half dozen Open Championships in the late 1800s. Where is Musselburgh, and what kind of course was it, and is it still around?
Oh, great question. And you're hitting to my heartbeat here. If you were to look at I'm actually doing this interview from my golf office, and I've dedicated most of this room to pre-1900 Musselburgh. So I have Willie Parks Sr., who won 4 Open Championships. His son won 2, and his brother won 1. He was the first Open Championship of all time, Open champion of all time, and all 3 of those hailed from Musselburgh. So Musselburgh was one of the 3 courses that hosted the original Open Rota. So for the first 13 years of the Open Championship, the Open was played, and a lot of people may not know this, was played at Prestwick. And through those original 13 years, it was only a 12-hole golf course. So to win the Open, you would actually play 3 rounds at Prestwick for a total of 36 holes. Now, after young Tom Morris won the Open Championship 3 times, he retired what was, if you're a WWE fan, like a championship belt. They used to play for a Moroccan belt, a silver. I liken it to a WWE championship belt. And the rules were back then that if you won the championship belt thrice in a row, 3 times, that you would then become the owner of that belt.
Oh, very cool.
Little side trivia. Yeah, a little side trivia for you. In 1870, the youngest Open Championship ever, Open winner ever, young Tom Morris, claimed his 3rd Open Championship in a row, and he takes the belt. So because of that, young Tom Morris, this is a little trivia question for you, is the only man to have ever canceled a major championship. Because quite frankly, in 1871, they did not have a trophy to give out, so they canceled the Open.
Oh, wow, interesting.
So Majors have been canceled due to war, but never because of one man, with the exception of young Tom Morris, who was an amazing golfing prodigy. He won the Open Championship 4 times in a row. So what happened was they lost this belt, and quite frankly, Prestwick didn't want to pay all the money it would take to replace it with what would be the Claret Jug. So what they did was they opened up into a partnership with the Honorable Company of Edinburgh Golfers, which was then at Musselburgh Links, and the R&A at St. Andrews. And so from that point on, from 1872 and on, the Open rotated between those three up until 1892, which is a totally different story. Musselburgh, oddly enough, was a 9-hole course. It was the only 9-hole course ever to host an Open Championship. You had Prestwick with 12 holes, and you had St. Andrews, which, as we know, has 18. And through all three of these venues, they would play 36 holes for the championship. It wasn't a 72-hole event.
Right.
So as to your question as to Musselburgh today, it is a eastern suburb of Edinburgh, which is the capital of Scotland. And it does exist today. It is probably one of the few courses that has been untouched by modern evolution.
Oh, wow.
So, and by the way, if any of your listeners are listening, you live over there in the UK, or you're here in the United States and you're visiting Scotland, I believe it costs $35 to play Musselburgh.
That's my kind of course.
Oh, and I'll tell you, one of the painting I have right in front of me is called at Miss Foreman's, right? So Mrs. Foreman's, forfeit at Mrs. Foreman's, sorry. And it's a championship match of 1870 between Willie Parks Sr. and old Tom Morris. But the cool thing about it is, I believe it was the 4th green was called Mrs. Foreman's hole. And you'll like this, and your listeners will like this. As you play the 4th hole, when you finish the hole, you would literally take 3 steps, and there was a pub right behind the green. And they'd serve you beer through the window. I mean, how perfect is that?
That's
and
perfect.
They were doing that back in the 1600s. They were serving beer from Mrs. Foreman's pub. So
that's
great
really
little
cool.
rich history of Musselburgh.
So I mispronounced it earlier. It's not Musselburgh, it's Musselburgh. I stand corrected. That's great.
That's all right.
Yep.
It's a Scottish thing.
Yep. Hey, so in 1874, along comes this guy named Mungo Park.
Great name, by the way.
It's an awesome name. And he wins the Open Championship.
Yeah.
Who was Mungo Park? And tell us a little bit about his golf lineage. You briefly mentioned it. After all, he was not the only member of the Park family to make his mark in golf.
No, he was not. I'll give you a little bit of perspective here. So I kind of mentioned the first Open Championship of 1860. So just to put this in perspective, from 1860 to 1875, so 15 years, only 2 men not named Park or Morris won the Open Championship. So that puts a little bit of perspective of the dominance between the Park family and the Morris family. That's Tom Morris and Willie Parks Sr. Now, from 1860 to 1875, that same period, only 3 men won the Open Championship without the first name Willie or Tom. The one that stands out, of course, is Mungo, who we're going to talk about today, who became one of the most unlikely major champions of all time. And so here's the story. Mungo Park was born in 1836. He is 3 years the junior to Willie Parks Sr. and learned the game of golf at the age of 4. He, unlike his brother, did not pursue the game of golf as a profession. Instead, he decided to be a fisherman. And these are the days where you'd go out on a boat, we wouldn't see you for months at a time. So Mungo, a non-professional golfer, right, spends his first 20 adult years of his life at sea. Not as a golfer. He's just purely a fisherman. And 20 years later, he comes back to land and is coaxed into playing in the 1874 Open Championship at Musselburgh by his brother. So Willie comes to his brother and Mungo and says, hey, I think you really should play in the Open this year. It's at Musselburgh, so it's right in your backyard. You don't have to travel to St. Andrews. You don't have to go to Prestwick. let's get together and let's play in this thing together. So you got to imagine, this is his first ever major. It's his first ever major tournament, which is outstanding to me.
What made anyone think that he could play? Did he play golf growing up? I mean,
yeah. He started at the age of 4. He played sporadically. He was playing golf at Musselburgh at the time, and I think he was competitive enough that his brother just said, "You know what? You're playing good enough golf. Why don't you just come play in the Open?" It's literally one day tournament of 36 holes back then.
Mm-hmm.
So it's one day of your life. And so Mungo enters the tournament literally an unknown. The man probably smelled like fish still, for all I know. And he goes out and wins one of the most improbable major championships by beating, at that time, the greatest golfer that had ever existed in young Tom Morris by a whopping 2 strokes. After 18 holes, which was the turn for them, he had a 4-shot lead. And at the end of 36 holes, he beat young Tom Morris by 2 strokes. And you have to think about this. So young Tom Morris is under the age of 24 at the time. He's 4-time Open champion. He had just won 4 in a row. He loses to Tom Kidd. He plays against Mungo Park in the 1874 Open at Musselburgh, and he is the clear favorite. And back then, if you were betting against young Tom Morris, you might as well be just handing out money because he was winning everything. He was that dominant. And Mungo comes out off the fishing boat and wins by 2 strokes over. I mean, listen, when people ask me to name my top 5 golfers of all time, young Tom Morris is in my top 5. He was that dominant. Wow. He changed the game.
Wow.
So it's like, I'm trying to think. It's like, watching one of those guys from The Greatest Catch come out and beat Tiger Woods in 2000.
Right.
I mean, it was that big of a wow.
Wow. What kind of game did Mungo have? I mean, what made him better than everybody else, particularly that day?
Yeah, well, I'll say this. Here's an unusual fact about the Park family. They were the greatest putters of all time. Willie Parks Sr. was considered the greatest putter of his era. Willie Parks Jr. was the greatest putter of his era and wrote the first ever putting book on golf called The Art of Putting. I'll give you a little bit more information than you want, but
no, please go ahead.
What happened was a gentleman by the name of Walter Travis in the United States, who was previous from Australia, read the book Art of Putting at the age of 35 and ended up becoming the best putter of his generation based on that instruction from Willie Park. And in the 1920s, when Bobby Jones couldn't seem to close a major, Walter Travis offered Bobby Jones a putting lesson, right? And Bobby Jones showed up late. He was still a teenager at the time for his putting lesson. And Walter Travis, the old man, as they called him, was upset by the fact that he was so rude to be late that he turned him down. 3 years later, he gives Bobby Jones that lesson, and Bobby Jones wins 13 majors.
Wow.
And becomes the greatest putter of his generation. So if I call it, who's the greatest putter of all time, I say the coaching tree going back to Willie Sr. is pretty strong.
Yeah, sure.
It's hard to find a better coaching tree than that.
Sure.
So the putting rang strong. Mungo and Willie Parks Sr. were also tremendously long off the tee back then. And long off the tee back then is not long off the tee now. It was probably under 200 yards off the tee. But then again, the course was shorter. A major championship course would be somewhere between 5,500 yards and 6,000 yards.
Mm-hmm.
You're playing with long-nosed wooden clubs with smooth face irons, probably no more than 7 clubs in your bag. As a matter of fact, most of them didn't even have a bag. They just had caddies carry their clubs.
Mm-hmm.
And you're playing a gutta-percha ball, which about every 3 holes, you need a new one because you've mangled it out of shape. So it was a different game back then, a little bit.
So really it was, are you saying that it was his putting that vaulted him to the top of the leaderboard to beat young Tom Morris? Yeah,
I mean, I think it's extremely fair to say, and I'd say that much like his nephew, Willie Parks Jr., who coined the phrase, a man who can putt is a match for anyone. So also under that same lineage is, you drive for show, putt for dough. He did not say that, but it's the same thing. I mean, he the great equalizer for Mungo and the Parks for that record was their prodigious putting. They could just putt the lights out of any green, and match that with you're playing on the Parks home turf.
Right.
So you have a home field advantage. You also have to understand that the folks at Musselburgh, they were known as those dirty miners at the time. It was a mining community.
Okay.
And we didn't have golf ropes back then. So the spectators would just walk right down the middle of the fairway. Okay. And this goes back to a story that goes back to 1870, which was that marathon match between old Tom Morris and Willie Parks Sr., this painting I have on my wall. And it's called Forfeit at Mrs. Foreman's because old Tom Morris got so ticked off that the spectators were kicking his ball into the rough.
Wow.
For this major, I mean, they're playing for money that would have bought a house.
Wow.
And here are these spectators interfering with his ball. He got to that pub hole, which I just mentioned, and literally went into the pub and refused to come out. And so my painting, the painting on my wall with Willie Park Sr. with a stern look, Willie Park is on the Mrs. Foreman's green, and in the background you can see old Tom Morris with a pint of beer, smoking a cigar, or not cigar, a pipe in the background, refusing to come outside. So it was a different game, but home field advantage and putting.
Yeah, I mean, a great combination to help anyone win a big tournament. Now, as you had mentioned, golf was a lot different back then as it is compared to today, of course.
It is, yeah.
Equipment was different. The ball was nothing like it is today. Course conditions were quite different. And
Absolutely.
You've already discussed somewhat that there were spectators there, but a tournament like that, how many spectators were there and how big were the fields and what was playing tournament golf like back then?
Yeah. So your spectators, you have to imagine now, the Open Championship was the tournament. So if you were ever going to go to a tournament to watch golf, that was the one. Your tournament rounds would have been fairly large from a spectator basis. It wouldn't be the thousands that we have today, but there were certainly hundreds, maybe as many as a couple thousand spectators in the crowd. So, you know, you'd have a pretty good grouping. They'd be following the favorites. St. Andrews would have certainly brought people down from the rail line to watch young Tom Morris and old Tom Morris fight for another Open Championship. Mm-hmm. You would have had folks coming in from North Berwick in Edinburgh, which, again, Edinburgh is the capital, and Scotland is a golfing, hub at that point. Mm-hmm. So there were certainly plenty of people and spectators on the property. The fields back then weren't what they are now. We didn't have international fields. We had players really back then from Scotland. Mm-hmm. I think we might have had a couple from England, but the majority were from Scotland. And for this tournament, I think we had somewhere in the realm of 40 to 50 players, which was quite common for those early Opens. But then again, these were the best players in the world. So I don't take anything away from them. These guys could have browbeaten anybody at the game of golf. And I can't tell you, they're shooting rounds in the 70s. As someone who's played gutty golf, shooting rounds in the 70s with a ball that goes less than 200 yards, has no spin, and you're hitting smooth face irons that have 10-degree gaps with a long nose wood, that's a damn good score. Tiger Woods would have a hard time shooting a 78 in a round with gutties. That's a guarantee. As a matter of fact, I'll give you a little case study of this. I played gutty golf out. I used to belong to a club called Elm Crest Country Club in Cedar Rapids, Iowa, when I lived in Iowa. This is when I first started playing gutty. Mm-hmm. And I took the head pro out to play golf with me. I said, we're going to go out and we're going to play some gutty golf. Now, I'm taking him out. He's never done it before. There are no wooden tees. So you tee your ball up with wet sand. Mm. So I'm carrying around a bucket of sand. Back then, there would be like a trough of sand or a big basket of sand and water that you'd make these tees out of. And on the first tee, I hit one right down the middle. Then I hand the long nose driver to Larry Gladson, who was one of the first coaches for Zach Johnson, by the way.
Oh, wow.
Great guy. Mm-hmm. And Larry hit like, I'd say a very semi-poor shot. And he just kind of like was like, oh, like, you know, he's like, this is different. And we get to the second shot. Now he's got a cleek. So a cleek's like a 3-iron. It's got a swing weight that's like probably an E2. So that's 10 swing weights heavier than a modern club.
Uh-huh.
And he basically foozles the shot, which means it goes nowhere. And he hands the club back to me. He goes, all right, I'm heading back to the clubhouse. It's just a different game, and it's hard. But if you take your ego out of it, it's a heck of a lot of fun just to realize how they played the game back then.
It sounds fun. I know that there are tournaments and organizations throughout the country, probably overseas as well, where they play hickory shafted golf, all different things. Hey,
I think there's only 4 gutty tournaments, I think, in the United States, maybe in the world. Mm-hmm. The majority are hickory, which is kind of like your 1920s. Mm-hmm. They're using kind of a modern ball with hickory shafted clubs with grooves. Mm. But gutties for the diehards, that's for sure.
Hey, back to Mungo.
Yeah.
He actually played in several Open championships. In fact, I think it was like 10 of them. And he finished in the top 10 4 other times.
He did,
Did he play golf in any other tournaments that you're aware of? Was there any sort of circuit for golfers to play on? Or was playing the Open Championship once a year, was that it?
Yeah, the Open Championship really changed Mungo's life. I mean, after that, he became a club maker with his brother, Willie Parks and Sons Golf Company. He became a teacher, as in a golf instructor, an architect, and then a professional. He posted 5 top 10 finishes in the Open Championship. To answer your question, there wasn't a tour at the time, but how the professionals made their money were essentially individual matches. So, for instance, right before young Tom Morris died, which would be almost a year, not even quite a year after this match occurred, Mungo Park and Willie Sr. took on old Tom Morris and young Tom Morris in a match. So what they do is they'd have these challenge matches, and they'd play for 100 pounds. And 100 pounds was a ton of money back then.
Right. Let me just interrupt. Were these things publicized? Were there spectators for there?
Oh yeah. It was kind of like the Old West. It was like the Wild West. Because what would that happen? It was really cool. If you go back to these old newspaper articles, a lot of times they would challenge them publicly. You know, like challenging you for the honor of I'm a better player than you for 100 pounds. And what they do is both sides, and these turned out to be like really big community events because everyone wanted to support their guy, right? Like everyone supported Willie Park. Senior was the king of Musselburgh. And so all of Musselburgh and Edinburgh would come out and they'd support him. And then you'd have, the Strath family, and you have the old Tom Morris family up at St. Andrews. And they'd play these matches. Sometimes they'd be home and home. Sometimes they'd be on neutral courts or neutral fields. But they'd play these 100-pound matches, and there'd be 3 to 4 of them a year. Or there'd be, 5, 6, 7, 8 with maybe different players where you just challenge that town's champion to a match. And back then, I mean, gambling might have been a national sport of Scotland back then. Because, I mean, people were really into it. If you look at any old painting of a golf scene, one of the most famous is The Match, Golfers. Mm-hmm. Right? It's called The Golfers or The Match at St. Andrews. Painted by, I'm blanking, Charles Lees. And if you look at that closely, there's at least 3 different portions of that painting where bets are being paid.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah. So, I mean, it's unbelievable. They're gambling on every match, every stroke, on a putt. It was really crazy at the time. So that was really your professional tour was really, I challenge you for the honor of who's the better golfer. And then once a year, you'd have the Open Championship for the outright champion golfer of the year.
Mm-hmm. How did Mungo fare in some of those challenges?
He did really well. He and his brother specifically, they oftentimes would play as a pair, and they were one of the most formidable groups. I'd say probably the greatest. Oh man, that's a really good question. So what would happen is young Tom Morris and Jamie Anderson of St. Andrews were probably unbeatable. But what would happen is people would challenge old Tom Morris, who was up there in age by then, and his putting stroke had gone to Hades. So he was really a liability, if anything, to young Tom Morris.
Mm-hmm.
So whereas normally you'd have young Tom Morris as this Tiger Woods versus the world, you'd have Tiger Woods, maybe a version of Jack Nicklaus, except with the exception of Jack Nicklaus can still sink putts. It got so bad that old Tom Morris was started to be referred to as the misser of short putts.
Oh, boy.
And there's a story that a postcard was sent to St. Andrews, and it was addressed to the misser of short putts, and it was delivered to old Tom Morris's.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow.
So it was well known. It was well known and tragic, really. But, the grand old man of golf. You can't stay on top forever.
Yeah, sure. Hey, in all your research, what intrigued you most about Mungo Park?
I think it's much like the next person we're going to talk about. I think I just like the idea of, here's this guy who's basically coming off a boat. He's spent 20 of his professional years, his adult life, at sea. And in the very first major championship he plays in, all he does is win. And not only that, he beats young Tom Morris, the greatest golfer of many generations up until that point.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, there's something to be said about that, right? Where guy comes out of the dark and just outright wins the Open Championship. He had 5 top 10 finishes in the next 10 years of the Open Championship. So here's this guy that's coming off the fishing boat, wins the Open Championship, says, you know what? I'm good with fishing. I'm gonna take up this golf thing, make a career out of it. And he does it. And he does it well. I mean, I wish I could do that.
Yeah,
right? I mean,
no
I
kid.
Play golf for a week, I'm ruined. Like my 2 handicaps of 20. You got to admire somebody like that.
Sure.
Who can just, he's like my dad. My dad cannot play golf for 3 years and he'll go out and shoot a 79. It's just like, it makes you want to throw up.
Oh, man.
Yeah, he's that guy.
Yeah. All right, let's move on to another winner of the Open Championship, David Brown. Now, he was born in Musselburgh, and ironically, he eventually passed away in, I hope I get this right, Inverest, Scotland.
Yeah.
And that's the same place that Mungo did. What makes the life and career of David Brown so intriguing?
David Brown, one of my favorite golfers of all time. Again, it's a very similar story. Here you have this guy. He's a professional golfer. He plays in his first Open Championship in 1880, and he does well. He's like tied 4th, tied 5th, something like that. He's like top 5, and he finishes top 5, and then he gives up the game, and he takes up a local trade. Apparently, he doesn't want to play on the road. He doesn't want to do these challenge matches, and quite frankly, probably doesn't have the name to get those 100-pound awards for winning. So he becomes a roofer, a local tradesman. And, so he kind of gives up the game. And he comes back in 1883 when he's coaxed into playing, and he comes in tied 24th. And so, again, at Musselburgh. So he's basically like a hometown hero, right? Just comes in, doesn't fare well. That's kind of middle pack. There's like 40 players in 1883. And you know what? It's just not his life. So he goes back to being a roofer. And he has no intentions of playing professional golf again, which is one of the great things about him. So here we have 1886. We have the Musselburgh field, which has now been put together by John Anderson, who's the secretary of the Musselburgh Club. He's overseeing the Open Championship in 1886. And John realizes that there's an odd number in the field, and he needs another player. So he's kind of in a full panic. This is the day of the Open Championship, mind you. I mean, this never happens anymore, right? Like, oh, we need a player. Let's grab that guy off the roof. So he basically runs like a couple blocks down, and here David Brown is a roofer on top of a roof putting tile down. And he knows him. He knows he can play golf, so it's not going to be a complete embarrassment. But he coaxes David Brown off the roof. And he says, listen, I need you to play in the Open Championship. Again, it's a one-day affair. Just give me one day of your life. Now, David comes down. He's convinced he's going to do it. He literally walks with John all the way to the club. Doesn't have his own sticks. Okay. He is wearing his roofer clothes. So it's not a good look. And he is given, I have this written down. This is well documented, by the way. John Anderson provides him with a change of clothes. And these are well documented. They gave him striped pants. And mind you, these are not thin striped pants. These are like convict pants. A frock coat. So a frock coat, for you folks in podcast land, basically is one of those old-fashioned like top hat kind of coats that goes down to your knees. Right? It is a very unusual. And they give him a loom hat, which is a top hat.
Oh,
that's what he's wearing to play in the Open Championship. I mean, he looks, I mean, like, how does he not look like a circus clown? Right? So they pull him off the roof. They dress them up like, you know, maybe my daughter would dress up a Barbie, all mismatched. I mean, he had to look like a fool. He hadn't played in 3 years in an Open Championship. He's coming off a roof, and he tees off within like 30 minutes with borrowed clubs. Okay. In the first round, Willie Campbell and John Lambert shoot a pair of 78s, and they lead David Brown by 1, which in and in itself, a field of 45 is kind of a miracle.
Sure.
So they make the turn at 18. Again, it's all in one day. Brown goes out and ties the course, the best score of the Open Championship, which was a 78, which was shot earlier that day by Willie Campbell and John Lambert. On the final 18, he shoots a 78, and he wins the Open by 2 strokes over Willie and Ben Campbell, and 3 strokes over prodigy Willie Parks Jr.
Wow.
So again, we have this story of, you know, here's this guy. I mean, it's almost more outlandish than Mungo.
I mean, this guy comes down off
in an Open.
Yeah, and he comes off a roofing job.
Off a roof.
And puts on a pair of clothes. They hand him some golf clubs. They go on out. We need an even number in the field, and he wins the darn thing.
And he wins it. So again, a most improbable win. And again, much like Mungo, this changes David Brown's life. Right? He becomes an instructor. He becomes a regular in the Open Championship. He then moves to the United States and becomes a pivotal pro in the United States. And then I think, as you mentioned, in 1903, years later, David Brown ties Willie Anderson in the 1903 U.S. Open.
Right. By the way, I want to get there. So hold on for one right before we get there.
You bet.
So he wins the Open Championship.
Yeah.
At that point, was it still a belt or a trophy was being handed out?
No. Yeah, it's well in. It is almost 15 years. No, it's almost 20 years. No, I'd say about 15 years since it's been the Claret Jug.
Okay.
Mungo also won the Claret Jug.
Okay. Now, one thing I find interesting is that, as you just said, in 1900, David packs up and moves to Boston. Yeah. Why? Yep. Why did he leave Scotland and come to the U.S.?
Yeah, if you look at it, so he let's go right to it. He wins the Open Championship 1886, and for the next almost 10 years, just about 10 years, he only has 2 finishes in the Open that are outside the top 10.
Mm-hmm.
So he's on fire. Actually, it was over 10 years. He had 2 finishes not in the top 10. And so he's kind of a hot commodity. And you got to imagine, so now we're into the late 1800s and early 1900s. In 1900, Harry Vardon travels over to America and lights the golf world on fire, at least for America. He's like the Johnny Appleseed of golf. Mm-hmm. He plays like 100 matches and only loses 2 of them. And he basically goes and plays all these, they were really dirt tracks, to be honest with you, but lights the fire of golf in the United States like it never had before. So you have David Brown, who is this winner of the Open Championship. He is a top 10 finisher for the last 11 Open Championships, and he's a hot commodity. Mm-hmm. So if you think about it, even in the United States, it was probably a subservient role, but, the United States at that time was still the land of opportunity. Mm-hmm. We didn't have the caste model that they certainly had in the United Kingdom, where the head pro was more of a servant than anything. I hate to say that, but that was kind of the way they were thought of. They were, I pay you, you stay in the pro shop, you don't come out of it. Whereas in the United States, they were pivotal because the game was so new. There was an opportunity to teach, tons of people the game of golf. We were expanding golf courses all over the United States at record scores. And here we have an Open Championship with a perfect resume to get a great job.
Interesting. So he comes over to the U.S., and in 1901, he finished 7th, if my research is correct. And the winner that year, by the way, was the same guy you said just before, Willie Anderson, who, by the way, we did an episode of Sports Forgotten Heroes about.
Really?
Yes, episode number 9 with Tony Parker from the World Golf Hall of Fame.
Yeah, I love Tony. Good guy.
Yep. And David finishes second, his highest finish in the event in 1903, losing to Willie Anderson in a playoff.
You're right.
What can you tell us about the 1903 U.S. Open Championship and how close Brown came to winning it?
Oh, yeah. I mean, it had to be almost a tragedy. Had he not won the Open Championship, it probably would have been quite painful. So David Brown comes in. You have to imagine now Willie Anderson, not quite at this time, but he's on the verge of unheralded popularity in the United States. And Willie Anderson, as I'm sure Dr. Tony Parker covered, was another lost champion. He died very early in his life after winning a record number 4 U.S. Open championships.
Yeah, in like 5 years. And I think he pitched something like pleurisy or something like that.
Yeah, you basically have Jack Nicklaus and Ben Hogan. And by the way, Willie Anderson died at the age of 31.
Yeah,
so
very young.
How many more he may have won because he was still in his prime. So right off the bat, first round of the U.S. Open 1903, Willie Anderson sets the tone. Right, he comes out, shoots a 73, and he's blazing. He's ready to take this puppy home. He comes out. This is Baltusrol Golf Club, and lights up a 73. He's got a 2-stroke lead on the field. And David is 6 strokes back. So he's really not in sight at this point. Second round comes about. David fares better, but not much better. He catches up on the field, but Willie Anderson goes out and shoots a 76, which is still that day the best round, I believe, of the tournament. So he goes 73-76. So that day he shoots the best round. You have David Brown shoots a 77, and he is 7 strokes back after two rounds, which, at that point, if you look at modern standards for U.S. Open, you have a player 7 strokes back after 2 rounds. You're not really counting on him to take this thing home.
Yeah, right? Pretty tough, pretty difficult to do.
So third round comes around, and here David Brown, and he's just playing consistent golf. He shoots a 75. So every day he's getting a little better, right? He's now at 231. Willie Anderson now, again, very consistent, shoots a back-to-back 76, and he's 225. So now he still has a 6-stroke lead going into the final round, right? This is a caliber champion. We have 2 major championship winners going head-to-head. Final round, unbelievably, Willie Anderson loses his stuff. He hits a couple balls in bunkers. Back then, you have to imagine the equipment we hadn't figured out bounce yet on our wedges. We didn't have wedges. We had niblicks, but they didn't have bounce. A lot of the soles had digs. So when you went into a bunker, it was a real hazard. So Willie Anderson comes in and cards an 82 with a total of 307.
Wow.
Now this is David Brown's chance.
Oh, boy.
David Brown's chance. David Brown, Mr. Consistent, goes 79, 77, 75, 76, and ties the great Willie Anderson for a playoff. Now, here's the weird thing. I don't like this about the history, but back then, they didn't play on Sundays, even in the United States. So the playoff didn't start till Monday.
Right, because they played 36 on Saturday.
Yeah.
Right.
So, yeah, they go 36 on, you're correct. They go 36 on Saturday, no golf on Sunday. Championship continues playoff, 18 holes on Monday morning. And so Willie Anderson comes out, does his thing. He shoots. They had terrible weather conditions. He posts an 82. David Brown goes side by side with him. He shoots a 42 on the front 9, just like Willie Anderson. So after 9 holes, they're tied up. And David Brown caught a couple bunkers and I think he had a 3-putt and ended up carding an 84 to lose by 2 strokes.
Wow.
To the great Willie Anderson.
Had Brown won that, would he have been the first to win both?
Yeah, he would have. Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah. I hadn't thought of that, but you're right.
Wow. How did golf differ from the game he was used to playing back in Scotland? Was there a difference?
Yeah, there was. I mean, our game was quite different. Let's see. This is 1903. So 1903, it probably wouldn't be fair to call our golf courses in America goat tracks, but it wouldn't be far from it if I said it.
Boy, have I heard that.
Yeah, so essentially, here's what would happen. A lot of our courses in the United States were set up with Victorian-style bunkers. So now today, if you're playing Baltus roll, your ball goes into a bunker. It goes down into the sand, right? And you're hitting out of the sand over, the field of play, right? Like the turf of the ground and the fairway are at the same level as the face of the bunker. Does that make sense?
Yes, sir. Certainly does.
Yeah. So back then, I called it the Victorian style of golf in the United States up until about 1908. So we're still right in there. So in 1903, the bunkers were, how do I say this? The sand would be level with the turf. So they'd be level with the fairway. They would be flat with the fairway. And what they did was they build up sod walls in front of the green. So facing you toward the green, there would be a 4-foot wall of dirt on your level. So you'd be sitting in the sand, and you'd have this mound of dirt sticking out of the turf 3 to 4 feet, straight vertical, and you'd have to go over it.
Oh, wow.
So it was very different. I mean, you had Garden City was one of the first courses to change that, and then National Golf Links of America really changed the face of golf on this continent anyway. When they built National Golf Links, which was Charles Blair McDonald, he brought in Scotland's most famous holes, which we call templates, and changed golf design in the United States forever.
Interesting. Outside of the U.S. Open, did David Brown play much golf, or did he work in the golf industry at all in the U.S.?
Yeah, he was a golf pro. So back then, really until the 1920s, when you were a professional, that meant you worked in a golf shop. So you were your local head pro. That was your full-time gig. And then, when you played in a Open Championship, that would be your chance to, go shine. And to give you an idea, you would win, like if you won like for instance, Willie Anderson winning the 1903 U.S. Open, he collected $200, which is roughly, I think I did this number before, $7,500.
Not a lot.
Yeah, I mean, even for today's standard, right? I mean, it's good money. It's not great money. So you're not buying a home. You're not doing anything spectacular with that money. You're just basically defending the honor of the club.
Huh. Interesting.
Yeah. So it was much more for individual honor than it was for reward.
So he basically, though, came here to the States because of the opportunities.
Yeah.
He ends up working in the golf industry. Now, if I understand correctly, or if I don't understand correctly,
go ahead.
He invested a lot of his money. He was here for quite some time, but like many, he lost his fortune in the Depression in 1929, and he returned home to Scotland.
Yeah, and basically died penniless.
Yeah, what was life like for him leading up to that, and then what was life like for him after he had returned to Scotland?
Yeah, so up until that point, before the crash, he was doing quite well. Definitely, I'd say extremely well for a golf professional. And he was living a very good life. And when the market crashed, I hate to correlate, how much money you have in the bank to your health, but let's just say it took a toll on him. Mm-hmm. And when he returned back to Scotland, I think it's safe to say he was the shadow of the man he was prior to the Great Depression. And to be fair, I think that's true for a lot of people in that era.
Sure.
We hadn't had a Great Depression. It was the first. and it destroyed everything from great golf courses to great people. Took the lives of many too early because they couldn't handle the financial strain, that was put upon their shoulders.
Sure.
And he was no different. It's tragic. There were other folks that lost their fortune and in very true light lost their lives shortly after because of the toll.
Sure. Why is David Brown an important figure in golf history, and what should we know or remember about him?
I mean, I think one of the things to take away, I think, again, if you're ever the guy who roots for the underdog, David Brown's your guy, right? I mean, unlike Mungo Park, he doesn't come from, any kind of inheritance of golf abilities. He doesn't come from a family of golfers. He's just like a hard worker. I mean, I think it speaks to him that here's this guy that gave up golf to be a roofer. I mean, there's, gives up a life of being a traveling professional, becomes a roofer, comes back on a whim, wins the greatest major of all time, makes a name for himself, and then uses that opportunity to make a life for himself in the United States, barring the Great Depression, a great life. So I like that story. I think it's one of those stories that's surprising. I like those kind of out of nowhere conversations. David Park, Mungo Park, and the next guy we're going to talk about is another equally great story about a guy that just comes out of the shadows and shines when the light's on him.
Yeah, I mean, Jack Fleck, let's jump ahead now.
Yeah,
1955, and it's
Unreal.
his introduction to the professional game is very similar.
Yeah.
So, Ben Hogan, right? Ben Hogan is the biggest name in the game, along with Byron Nelson, who I guess at that point might have, in 55, he was basically retired from the game.
Semi-retired.
But he still had Sam Snead.
Yep.
And Jack Fleck, he was a virtual unknown. He turned professional in 1939, and he had never won an official PGA event until 1955.
Yeah.
So first, before we get into the 55 U.S. Open, who was Jack Fleck? And tell us about his career up until 1955.
Yeah, there's not a lot to tell.
No, there's not.
Here's this guy, he's kind of out of nowhere, he's born in Bettendorf, Iowa, right? So he's the first Iowan ever to win a major. Zach Johnson being one as well, by the way. And I'm an Iowa boy too, so this is a very good story for me to tell. I like this story of Jack Fleck because he was also a very humble guy and a God-fearing guy, which is always nice to have in your major championships. So anyway, he's born in 1921. He is born and lives through the Great Depression. He comes from a family of farmers. In the late 20s and early 30s, he ends up kind of being forced into being a golf professional. And the reasoning is the family, and this isn't widely reported, but I think it was 1926. I'm almost 100% sure on that. The family lost their farm. So it was about 3 years before the Great Depression kicked off, but there was already some pinch of the Great Depression in the Midwest. And it came to light, and his family felt it, and essentially they lost the farm. And so, he starts working. He works as a caddy and kind of works his way up into his game. He becomes a pro, like you said, in 1939. And he's kind of like scrounging around a living. His main job, oddly enough, is working as a municipal golf pro. So he's not even at the level where, he's like Ben Hogan was the pro at Hershey Country Club. Sam Snead was at the Greenbrier. I mean, these are like well-known established clubs. He's at a place, I think it was called Duck Creek, which is a municipal golf club in Bettendorf or in Davenport. And he's literally nowhere. He comes out of nowhere, and he's one of the most improbable wins. He is literally perhaps the greatest David versus Goliath story in all of golf.
Sure. I mean, when you read about what he did, but before we get there, he also served his country in the Navy.
He did. Yeah, he did. Yeah, he was. Go ahead, please.
Yeah, and I think he was actually involved in Normandy.
Yeah, he was one of the gentlemen who stormed the beach of Normandy. And I'll tell you another quick little story that, and this is after he gets back, obviously, but before we get into this big match, in 1955, he meets up with the pro at St. Petersburg Country Club. And sitting on the desk of the pro, I can't remember the pro's name, was a brand new set of the first ever Ben Hogan irons. And I don't know if you know this, but what he did was he was talking to the pro and he was like, boy, those are nice. Do you think Ben Hogan would make me a set? And the pro just like looks him up and down and is like, what have you done? Right? I mean, like, who are you to expect to get a set of, these irons? So anyway, he goes out of his way, writes a letter to Ben Hogan, and Ben Hogan returns the letter and says, you know what? Why don't you come out and play in the Colonial Invitational and you'll be my host? So he shows up at the Ben Hogan factory. I mean, he is literally no one at this point. He is less than no one. He's your journeyman pro who today would be going back and forth from the web.com to the PGA Tour every once in a while. That was and working in a muni club. So he goes in, and Ben Hogan, Jack Fleck liked to believe that Ben Hogan brought him in and kind of struck up a friendship with him because of his background. Both came from poor backgrounds. I mean, the story's known now. It wasn't back then that Ben Hogan's father committed suicide.
Right. Put
a lot of pressure on Ben. And much like that, Jack's family, while his parents were still alive, they lost the farm and kind of pushed him into working a little bit earlier than maybe some of his compatriots. And so they kind of struck it up, and Ben Hogan took his specs, and he made one of the first ever Ben Hogan golf clubs for a professional for Jack Fleck.
Wow, the irony.
No, it gets better. So, now we're, months later, we have the U.S. Open and Olympic and at the Olympic Club, and Jack Fleck shows up to do, his practice rounds. He plans on playing like 80 holes just to get used to the course because he's never been there before. And Ben Hogan's already there. Surprise, surprise, practicing. Ben Hogan finds him on the range, and he goes, by the way, I made you 2 additional clubs. Here's 2 wedges that you'll love. So Hogan goes out of his way to find Jack Fleck, makes these wedges for him, specifically for him to play in the U.S. Open, and hands them to him right before, his practice rounds.
Wow.
Which really goes against what most people think about Ben Hogan being, this hard-headed, impersonal, jerk, if you will.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
So essentially you have, if you want to call it the Davis versus Goliath, you have a 9-time major championship winner in Ben Hogan, a 4-time U.S. Open champion versus a club professional from a small municipal golf club in Iowa. I mean, it's unbelievable. So Jack Fleck at that time had played in, I think, 3 majors. And in those 3 majors prior to 1955 had missed the cut and had finished 52nd and 64th.
Wow.
So he was a zero threat.
Yeah, all he really did was he played in a lot of local events, and he won a few small tournaments, not anything on the PGA. Yeah. And he gets out on tour. Tell us about those early years, if you can, and how hard it was for him. And what interests me most is what did he do to support himself? Was it being the club pro? I think a lot of those guys back then would, the club professional job was really supporting their, professional ambitions. His pro job had to be one of the lesser paying jobs. I mean, it's a municipal golf course. It's not it's not Cedar Rapids Country Club or Davenport Country Club. It's, Duck Creek. And, I think he always had a good mindset. I mean, I think you can say that about what he did in the U.S. Open here. He just always believed in himself. He was a religious man and put his faith in God and just, basically said, this is what I'm meant to do. And I basically dink and dunked and won a couple opportunities to play good enough to play in the U.S. Open and earned his shot. Yeah, I mean, in 55, it was 1955, and that's the year he decided to give the tour a chance full time.
Chance. Yeah.
Right. So that's the similarity to David Brown is, Brown comes off the roof and goes out and wins the Open Championship. This is really Jack's first year on tour. So what prompted the decision? And again, I ask, what made him think he had the game to compete with the likes of a Hogan or a Snead, a Tommy Bolt, a Julius Boros, a Jackie Burke, and all the others who were winning out on tour?
Yeah.
Sam Snead. Yeah. What gave Jack Fleck the idea that he could actually go out on tour and compete with those guys and maybe even win?
Yeah, I think you could probably ask this of every major championship winner. And I think the guy just had self-belief. I mean, I really think that when it came down to it, going into the U.S. Open, he had a feeling he was winning that tournament.
Wow.
As a matter of fact, if I remember right, he was on the range at the Olympic Club hitting balls. And much like Johnny Miller's story of the 1973 U.S. Open, I believe he believed that God spoke to him, whether directly or he felt his presence or whatever you want to call it, and just felt like this was his to win.
Interesting.
And what's funny is you wonder if he, if you want me to jump in, I will, but you wonder after the first round if he still had that, because Jack Fleck after the first round was 9 strokes off the lead.
Exactly. Before we get there, one other question before we get there.
You bet.
How did he qualify for the U.S. Open? Was it like qualifying today? Did you have to qualify? How did he find himself?
He had to qualify. There was regional qualifying, and he played his way in.
Okay, so here we go. The Olympic Club in San Francisco, not exactly an easy course to navigate.
No, very tough, as a matter of fact.
And as you just said, he was Jack Fleck, was less than remarkable in the first round. Tell us about that round. And like you said, he was 9 strokes off the lead.
Yeah, it was a horrific round for him. Yeah, it is. Matter of fact, we all know how the story is going to end, so I don't think I'm giving anything up. But it was the biggest swing from being 9 strokes back. I believe 9 strokes back to win is the biggest swing ever in U.S. Open history. Mm-hmm. And it might be in all major championship history. You don't go 9 strokes down and win a major championship. It just doesn't happen. Mm-hmm. So he went out and, he shot a 76. And Tommy Bolt at the time shot a 67, 3 under par. So after the first round, Jack Fleck is 9 strokes off the lead of Tommy Bolt and 4 strokes behind Ben Hogan.
Mm-hmm.
And yet, even after that first round, he thinks he's going to win it. I mean, I love this guy. How do you not love somebody who, you know what I mean?
But what changed about his game? What gave him that confidence? What did he do in the second round to?
I'll tell you what Ben Hogan would say. Ben Hogan would say he had the best irons in the game.
Yeah, they were Ben Hogan irons.
The best irons in the game helped them. And I think between having best clubs in the game, according to Ben Hogan, I'm sure, and that self-confidence, and I think it's just those two. He was just driven. He was kind of a man to be reckoned with. And, it speaks to it. He comes back in the second round and fires a 69, which I believe was tied for the best round of the day.
Right, right.
I mean, in a single round, he is 1 stroke off the lead. He goes from 9 strokes off the lead to 1 stroke off the lead. Think about that. That's an 8-stroke swing to the field.
It's incredible. But
that
then,
doesn't happen.
Yeah, and then the next day, Saturday, again, they play 36 holes.
Yeah.
The morning round, the third, he didn't play all that well, but he sure as heck turned it around.
Yeah.
In the final round. So what about Saturday?
Hogan fires a 72 in the third round. Fleck, I wouldn't even say stumbles, but he shoots a 75, which was, listen, folks, you got to remember, Olympic Club was a bear back then. It's a bear now, but bear under those conditions with persimmons, big time. So he is 3 strokes off the lead going into the final round. Now, what you have to remember about the final round in the U.S. Open back then is we didn't stagger people by by their score of the previous round. People had designated times they went off. Okay. So here we have, after round 3, Fleck is 3 off the lead, held by Ben Hogan, Sam Snead, and Julius Boros. I mean, if you're going to have a fearsome threesome, you're going to try to beat, that's it. So one of my favorite stories about the 1955 U.S. Open starts now. So what happened is back then, NBC covered the U.S. Open, but there was only an hour's worth of coverage.
Mm-hmm.
So what they basically got was Ben Hogan finishing his round. So the 4th round starts with Hogan has a 3-stroke lead over Fleck. He finishes with a 70, which is the lowest round of the day other than one man, who hadn't finished. So we have Jack Fleck, who's like 5 holes back, and Hogan posts a 70. And at that time, I believe that, it was a 12-stroke lead over the field minus him.
Wow.
Let me double check that. It's something like that. So he goes, So he has a 12-stroke lead over everyone in the field except one man.
Jack Fleck.
Yeah.
And people have got to be saying, who is Jack Fleck?
Oh, absolutely. So I'm sorry, he had a 5-stroke lead over the field. So there's no way. Yeah, it's basically Jack Fleck has 5 holes to play and is a stroke back at that point. And NBC is finishing its coverage. This is one of my favorite stories. And as a matter of fact, there's a photo to actually document this. And so Gene Sarazen is a commentator for the NBC broadcast, and he congratulates Ben Hogan on TV for winning his 5th U.S. Open. and the photographers asked Ben Hogan to hold up his hand with the number 5 to designate his 5th Open. And that is a famous photo. A lot of people have seen that of him holding up his hands, and they think it's him showing the calloused hands. It's him designating his 5 U.S. Open victories.
Oh, wow.
So Ben Hogan later said he thought he won the U.S. Open by 2 strokes. He knew how hard those finishing holes were, and he thought for sure that he had won it. So here we go. Jack Fleck now bogeys the 14th hole, right? So he has 4 holes to play, and he's now 2 strokes down. So he's got to birdie the next 2 of the next 4 holes at this place, which no one's going to do. NBC closes its telecast. Ben Hogan heads into the locker room. And so Ben Hogan's changing the locker room, and everyone's basically congratulating him for winning his 5th U.S. Open. And, he's kind of like, well, it's not over yet. But at the same time, in his head, he's won it.
Sort of like the Heidi game in football.
Yeah, exactly. Yes, exactly like that. So right after this, so I said Fleck bogeys the 14th hole, so he's 2 back. So Fleck looks around once he gets on the 15 tee box, and all the observers are walking away because he's lost the tournament in their eyes. So he gets mad. I mean, he really gets mad, and it makes him concentrate. And he goes out and he birdies 15. So now Ben Hogan's sitting back in the clubhouse, in the locker room, and he hears this faint cheer in the distance, right? And word comes back that he's birdied the 15th. But Ben Hogan and everybody else is like, listen, those last 3 holes are a bear. There's very little chance he's going to win this thing. So what happens is Fleck keeps going. He pars the next 2 holes. Now he has to birdie the treacherous 18th hole.
Oh, boy.
And Hogan's sitting there in the locker room. He's heard that he's got to birdie the last hole. He's feeling very good. Word trickles in that now Fleck has hit his ball in the right rough with a front side pin, leaving himself a treacherous 7-iron in like 4-inch, 5-inch rough. And it's pretty much acknowledged by most in the room, maybe not Hogan at the time, that Hogan had won his 5th U.S. Open. Again, by the way, because he'd already been congratulated. And Hogan, all of a sudden they hear another cheer, and Hogan knows that he's hit one close. He's not even watching. So Fleck hits one to about 7 feet. And now Hogan is in pure dread because he wants him either to par the hole, right? Or he wants him to eagle the hole. He does not want the birdie because he doesn't want a
playoff. Doesn't want 18 holes. And part of that has got to be what people might not remember is the accident that affected Ben Hogan. He didn't play every tournament every week.
No.
This guy had bad legs.
Yeah. Yeah. So at that time, I believe the only complaint he had right there was his left knee was aching him, which was pretty good for him. And he goes out, he makes the putt. They go into the playoff, and
what was Hogan's reaction when Fleck birdies that hole to tie?
The story goes is that right before he heard that second cheer, that one that put him on the green, Hogan had his hands, his face in his hands. Like he was like I said, anything but a playoff is what he wanted. And it put him in a bad spot. And then he birdies the hole. And, we don't know because Hogan kept a lot in. All he said was, "I'll see you boys tomorrow." I mean, it was as simple as that. "I'll see you boys tomorrow." And, the playoff starts the next day. Jack Fleck's feeling good about himself. He believes himself. Hogan, one day more weary. And, Jack Fleck just outplayed him, quite frankly, just outplayed him.
And no one gave Fleck much of a chance in a one-on-one showdown against Ben Hogan.
Well, I mean, you got to think Ben Hogan's winning it even a playoff. I mean, that's where the smart money was. As a matter of fact, one of Jack Fleck's friends was asked if he was worried about Ben Hogan playing with Jack Fleck in the playoffs. Because he said to him, he's like, Ben Hogan doesn't say much on the golf course. And his buddy said, "Well, you don't know my buddy Jack. I guarantee he'll say less to Hogan than Hogan does to him." I mean, he was there to work. He wasn't there to talk. And he goes out the next day and, I mean, I don't want to say owns Hogan, but he never was down. He ends up winning by 3 strokes over Ben Hogan, the Hawk.
Wow.
And becomes the most guaranteed improbable modern day major champion because unlike Ben Curtis and Michael Campbell and many that have followed, this guy was a instructor at a municipal. He was Tin Cup. It was Tin Cup. He was your Tin Cup moment right there.
Yeah.
That's the best comparison you can give.
So quitting his job as a club pro and going out on tour full time, I guess sort of the right decision.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, after that, for sure. I mean, you got to just love. I mean, Jack Fleck, and he never lost that humbleness.
Mm-hmm.
He had, you call it the Iowa boy thing or, just like Zach Johnson, extremely humble in life. And he was always like that, even after his, great U.S. Open victory. Now, what a lot of people forget is Ben Hogan never won another major after his amazing Triple Crown in 1953.
Sure.
He let 2 U.S. Opens kind of slip through his hands. This one, and in 1960, he was a playoff with Arnold Palmer at Cherry Hills and lost that in the playoff, I believe, on the 17th hole. He uncharacteristically hit it in a tree on the right-hand side of the fairway and I believe took a bogey. I played Cherry Hills. I hit it into that tree, and I took a par. I just want to say, Ben Hogan, the only time I've ever won up Ben Hogan, I promise you. But, it's unfortunate that Hogan, after 53, after the pinnacle of his career, was in a lot of majors, but never won another one.
Right.
And you know what? And to this day, I'll give you a modern day perspective of that is, I'm wrong here, by the way, but I thought we were going to be saying the same thing about Tiger Woods. I thought he would be like Ben Hogan. I thought their accidents and their comebacks would be parallel to each other in that they'd hit this age where they're competing in majors but may never win one again. And then, of course, Tiger proves me wrong at the Masters, so good for him.
And he still might win a couple more.
He might.
Who knows?
He might. Then again,
just
though,
incredible. You
never know with history.
Yep.
Like I said, history plays us all a fool.
Yep.
It is known for taking the great prognosticators and making fools of them.
Yeah.
As Tiger Woods proved to us all by winning the Masters.
He sure did. Now, Fleck never won another major either. And, he really didn't excel on tour afterwards. He won just 2 more tournaments. Tell us about his career.
Yeah, I mean, he had his career was not really eventful from then on. I mean, I think you'd say he was kind of like a Mike Weir. I think that's probably a good way to say it.
Sure.
He only had, I think you could correct me if I'm wrong because I'm not looking at anything here, but I believe he had 2 top 10s in majors thereafter. He was sporadic when he did play. He didn't play at every U.S. Open after. I think he was top 5 in a U.S. Open, and that might have been at Cherry Hills. And then I think in 62, 2 years later, he was top 10. But outside of that, he withdrew from a lot. He had a bunch of top 30 finishes. He had a couple top 20s, but it was really unremarkable. I don't want to take anything away from him. That's probably a cruel way to say it, but he was better than a journeyman pro. He was out there. He was competing. He was doing well, but he wasn't winning tournaments like you'd expect a major championship winner to win.
Sure.
I think he had 3 PGA Tour wins in his career, and that's including the major. So, but again, he wrote his way into history. And to be fair, Ben Hogan was so happy for Jack Fleck. I mean, first of all,
that's
was
nice.
His first ever win by Ben Hogan and his golf company. So he, you say what you will, but Jack Fleck proved that Ben Hogan could make quality clubs.
So technically, in a way, Ben Hogan won as well.
Yeah, well, yeah. I mean, they were both in a playoff playing Ben Hogan clubs, right? So pretty hard to argue with those kind of numbers.
Right. So I know how we should.
Marketing machine would run away with that.
Yeah. So I know how we should remember Jack Fleck as one of the most improbable winners in the history of the U.S. Open. Connor, this has been a lot of fun. I want to thank you so much for joining me on Sports Forgotten Heroes. Tell us again about Talking Golf and when the new episodes are released, and are you working on anything else?
Yeah, so let's see. Talking Golf History is basically every other week. We have special podcasts for the major championships. We bring on famous guests and golf historians. And the whole point is, I think much like your podcast, is to make history interesting.
Yeah.
We'll never share something that's going to put you to sleep. As a matter of fact, if you're ever going to be introduced to the podcast, I would recommend you going to our rules edition, because it is one of the funniest podcasts you'll ever hear in golf, where I go through all the rules of golf going back to the 1700s and basically pick out the funniest rules you've ever heard of.
Oh, that sounds like fun.
And yeah, I mean, you'll get a good kick out. There are club rules, like I can't remember the name of the club. There's a club in Chicago that has the weirdest club rules you'll ever see, and they run even to this day. And then there's the wartime rules of World War II, and those are amazing. So I go through each one of them. Like if your ball lands in a bomb crater and the bomb has not detonated, you are allowed to lift, clean, and replace. Thank you very much. But if the bomb goes off during your golf swing, you'll have to take a 1-stroke penalty if you replace your ball. And I'm like, come on. And I'm like, there are literally things like if we are under enemy invasion, like the Nazis are running down the fairway, you are allowed to leave your ball and come back, and you will not be penalized for time. And I'm like, how great is that? I mean, like, the Scots got it right. I mean, like, we're playing through a war here, folks. Let me play through.
That's awesome.
Yeah, there's some really fun stuff. So other projects, I'm working on a couple videos, hopefully that'll make the Golf Channel. Some conversations there about future major championships and bits like the Lost Legend of Lido. And I'm thinking about kicking off a new podcast called 50 Things That Made the Modern Game of Golf.
Oh, interesting.
And it's all like, those will be like short 15-minute podcast on things that you might not know about the history of the game of golf, but then there might be things like graphite shafts, and that's a full episode. Mm-hmm. So, a 15-minute episode on how graphite shafts changed the game. So things like that. So it's kind of fun.
Oh, that is fun. Well, no doubt you're very passionate about golf, and I want to thank you again for coming on Sports Forgotten Heroes. And I hope you'd consider coming back sometime.
Absolutely. I'd love to. I had a really great conversation with you. It's always fun to talk about somebody who cares about golf history or history in general.
Yeah, it is. It's a lot of fun. Connor, thanks again for joining me on Sports Forgotten Heroes, and I'll be sure to tune into Talking Golf as well.
Yeah, I love your podcast. Keep doing that great work.
All right, thanks. When I opened today's episode and talked about the fact that there have been many golfers who have won a major championship whom we never heard of until they won, I was talking about guys like John Daly, Brooks Koepka, Ben Curtis, Keegan Bradley, or guys like a Walter Berkemo, Chandler Harper, Johnny McDermott, to mention a few. As for Mungo Park, he never won anything of significance again. David Brown came close, and Jack Fleck won the 1960 Phoenix Open and the 1960 Bakersfield Open. He also won the 1979 PGA Seniors Championship, which, let's give Jack the respect he deserves. That was no small task. After all, that is a major championship too. And in 1995, he teamed with Tommy Bolt to win the Liberty Mutual Legends of Golf. But that's it. None of the three really did much of anything after their improbable wins at the Open Championship and the U.S. Open. I hope you enjoyed this edition of Sports Forgotten Heroes, and again, thank you to Connor for joining us. Next time, we're going to talk about the career of a terrific pitcher, Ray Collins. He was a force with the Boston Red Sox before injuries forced him to retire after the 1915 season, just his 7th in the majors. Thanks again for listening, and we'll see you next time on Sports Forgotten Heroes.
We here at the Sports History Network proudly partner with 26 podcasts, all revolving around the history of sports. But did you know that many of our hosts were sports history authors way before they started their shows? It's true. We've got Joe Ziemba, host of When Football Was Football, Joe Zagurski, host of Pro Football in the 1970s, Mark Morthier, host of Yesterday Sports, Tommy Phillips, host of Lombardi Memories, and Scott Adamson, co-host of From the 55-Yard Line. All these authors have many books for you to choose from. To check them out, go to our website at sportshistorynetwork.com/sportshistorybooks. Pick up your copy today. Soundtrack provided by Kevin MacLeod of filmmusic.io.